Whole genome sequencing at birth, genomic data, a resource from cradle to grave. The hashtag tonight is Genomics Conversation, and this event has been made possible thanks to the generous support of Genomics England. Some of the questions that we're hoping the experts and advocates will address tonight are the following, really. So is it feasible to think about a newborn baby's whole genome sequence as a secure resource that can be of ongoing benefit to that person once they reach adulthood? And how can we ensure that this, this precious data is and remains secure? How should the transition be managed between the time when the parents must make the decisions about the child's genomic data and the time when the child can make their own mind up about what should be done? And what can we learn from elsewhere, other areas of healthcare about this transition? Another issue is, in what circumstances is it useful and appropriate to reanalyze a whole genome sequence that's been previously analysed? What new discoveries may be made? How and when and by whom will it be decided that a particular person's genome should be reanalysed? What is the role of patient choice in these matters is a really important issue. You know, if a patient's whole genome sequence is stored and reanalysed, what might be the impact on that patient's clinical care? And how might that patient's views and change of views over their lifetime be accommodated, and you know, what could be done to anticipate if they change their mind about what their genome can be used for example? So how can that be dealt with, and how can their views be respected? Catherine is Assistant Director of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics.
Right, I am going to start us off with an introduction really to the topic that we're talking about tonight, which is the idea of having a genomic resource for life. And I'm going to talk a bit broadly about how thinking about this through an ethics lens can be helpful, and then lead on to my fellow panelists to talk about some of those issues in more detail. Genomics England is now thinking about and exploring sequencing the genomes of babies, healthy babies, potentially at birth, as part of a screening programme. So I think it's a natural next step, a natural question to ask. Well, once we've bothered doing that, why don't we save it for later? It could be useful both for the person, the individual, the child when they grow up, but also it could be an amazing resource for research, of course. I think it's worth noting that we do already keep the blood spot cards, which is the samples from the heel prick test that babies are currently offered for up to 5 years, or at least 5 years, I think. And researchers can access that at the moment. So that does already happen, and people don't really seem to mind about that. Whether that's because people don't know that happens, I don't know. Or maybe now we're at a point where the idea of a whole genome sequence being stored is of a different magnitude, and it's raising now these kind of questions that we're talking about tonight. So certainly it's an ethical issue. In fact, it's several ethical issues. So I thought I might just quickly take a step back and think about when is ethics important? You often hear people say, oh, ethics is part of our everyday conversation, we just don't realize it. And I think there's some truth in that, but that doesn't necessarily help you when you're thinking about when do you bring in ethics expertise, or when, as a policymaker or researcher, should you put a particular kind of ethics lens on things. And on the screen, I've just come up with sort of three scenarios where that might be. It's when science and medicine don't give you a clear answer, which I think is often. When there's disagreement amongst experts and the public about fundamental values, so our beliefs about what is the right or wrong thing to do, and when it's very sensitive and hard to talk about without causing offence. And I think this question certainly comes into the first two of those scenarios. So why think about ethics? What can ethics offer you? We really firmly believe at the Nuffield Council that thinking about ethics can lead to better policy or better research or better whatever it is that you're interested in, because you'll be thinking, what you'll be doing will be serving the public interest. And that in turn is more likely to earn public support and trust, and simultaneously less likely to attract controversy. So what's underneath an ethical problem? It's usually because there are a number of important factors at play, and they are often in tension with each other. So on the slide here, I've just put some examples of the kind of things, things we might be trying to achieve through an initiative such as the one we're talking about tonight. But it's impossible to do all those things to the maximum. So, for example, if you wanted to make sure, maximize health across the population, maximize benefit, you might make this program mandatory, but you wouldn't, because also people's autonomy is important, and their right to live their lives in the way they want to live is important. So you wouldn't. So you need to, there's a balancing act that has to be done to try and make sure you get the best of as many worlds as possible. There's also a big picture here. So I think it's tempting sometimes when you've got a new exciting technology, a new exciting capability even, and think about what can we do with it. But if we started with the ends, as in what is it we actually want to achieve, would that technology be the right answer? And I think it's always important to kind of make sure we've got that in perspective. So for example, the technology we're talking about at the moment is a lifetime genomics resource. Would that be the best way to meet some of these ends? I think for some of them, for sure, supporting research and innovation, this sounds like a great idea. We'd have a huge genomics database, it'd be an amazing resource. But for the other things, if really our aim is to improve child and population health more generally, would genomics, even in itself as a sort of genomic analysis, be the answer, and let alone the storage of genomic information throughout a person's life? So I think it's important to go back to that. The other things that are at play is, and this has often been the case with sort of genomics healthcare policy, is it's a merging of a sort of clinical situation or public health situation now with a biotech research and innovation situation. And the ethics of those two things are a little bit different. So with public health, you're thinking about what kind of harm you're trying to prevent, what evidence have you got your intervention will be effective, what's a proportionate and a fair response, what's a fair use of public resources. If you're coming from a biotech angle, you're thinking slightly differently. You're thinking, is this the best technology that we want to bet on to get what we want to get to? Are we overhyping our technology? Are we focusing on the public interest or maybe other things? So I think it makes this question we were talking about tonight a little bit complicated. So how do we find a way through? There's probably lots of different ways, but having worked at the Nuffield Council for a long time, I thought I would share with you how we tend to tackle these kind of complex problems. We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach, but there are some common features of the way in which we work. So I thought I would just share with you six things that we pretty much always do when we're thinking about these things. So we're clear about what we want to achieve or what success might look like. We always look at the scientific evidence. This isn't about theoretical philosophizing, and we also look at existing ethics guidance. The UK has an extremely rich ethics ecosystem, both in sort of academia, but also within third sector bodies such as the council, and also several government organisations as well. We don't need to reinvent the wheel each time. And there's also a huge amount of work done internationally as well that we can draw on. We always involve a wide range of experts. We always give people affected a say. This is crucial. And in this particular case, the public dialogue that Genomics England and the UK National Screening Committee commissioned already gives us quite a really good kind of window into what members of the public are thinking about this, which is what we should do when we're thinking about screening, because screening involves everyone, potentially. So then we move more into an analysis phase. We've gathered all that information, evidence. What then are the important factors at play? What is important to people in society? And then sometimes we leave it there. Sometimes we go a step further and look for policy solutions, which is that balancing act I mentioned earlier. So we haven't gone through this process, but I just, for the purposes of this presentation, had a quick think of, like, theoretically, if we had, and we had identified these four factors as the most important, how then might we kind of reconcile them? So first we might think about what benefit exactly we're interested in. It might be these things. What harm are we particularly interested in preventing? What do we mean by respecting autonomy? might be interested, of course, in informed choice, but maybe about the child's right to make choices when they're older and not take those away from them. And we're more likely to be interested in tackling health inequalities as well. If we had all of those things to balance, what would a appropriate policy solution look like in the middle here? And I'm going to end there and then leave it to my panelists to talk a bit more detail about some of the issues that I've mentioned and more.
I thought I'd start with a little story to give you the journey of my life, really, and then I'm going to revisit that same story and talk you through the same story but through the lens of newborn screening. I'm going to need a little bit of imagination from you all, so hopefully you can do that, but I'm going to start with right at the beginning of my journey. So my parents tried for quite a number of years to have a baby and had fertility issues, and then a number of years later along came this beautiful baby. I know I'm biased, it is me. As you can see by the terrible 70s looking rug, it's quite an old photo and it's not great quality either. We didn't have great cameras back then. But to all intents and purposes, I was a very typical baby with no known health issues, and very nothing of note to the medical profession, and no doubt my parents were over the moon to have such a wonderful, well-behaved child after such a long time of trying. And then in childhood, again, terrible 80s fashion in this one. This is me as a child with my little brother, who also has had at the time and still has no known health issues. Very normal childhood, very average medical history. I did have whooping cough. I'm not even sure whether whooping cough still exists actually, but I'd had whooping cough and chicken pox and the normal kind of childhood stuff, but nothing of any particular interest to the medical profession at that stage. And here is me enjoying some rum on holiday in Ibiza as a young adult, and again, nothing particularly of interest to the medical profession at that point either. So a very, very typical growing up, and nothing that would be of interest to any genetic researcher at that stage. And then I turned 34 and something a little bit strange happened. My face felt a bit strange on one Sunday afternoon, and I didn't really know what was going on, and within a couple of hours I was getting these spasms in the side of my face, which was pulling my face down and pulling my neck muscles as well, and was quite painful. It was very scary at the time. I had previously had Bell's palsy, so I did kind of assume that it was the same thing, but it was different this time. So I ended up at the emergency doctors, and the doctor was, we had a discussion about it's not Bell's palsy because the spasms are, your face is going into spasm and releasing, and that's not a Bell's palsy. Checked me for signs of a stroke and didn't appear to be that either. And I happened to mention that I had a cousin who'd been diagnosed recently with a condition called dystonia. I didn't really know what dystonia was at the time, but I did know that her face pulled also. And the doctor said, well, I've never seen a patient with dystonia before, but it does sound like it could be. We need to refer you to neurology. And there started my journey. I'm now a patient with a clinical diagnosis of dystonia. And I don't currently have a genetic diagnosis, but I am on the 100,000 Genomes project, and I'm hoping at some stage for a genetic diagnosis. We are going to then revisit that story. So I want you to use your imagination here. We're going to go right back to the beginning. Now, we're going to have to imagine that this is not the 80s now, because clearly we weren't researching this stuff in the 80s. We need to imagine that this is in the future. Let's imagine that there is a newborn screening programme in place, and dystonia is one of the conditions that that is looked for in that newborn screening. And let's imagine you've got two parents who have tried to have a baby for quite a number of years, and then this baby comes along and they're asked about newborn screening, and they say, yes, we want to do that, please. And the doctor comes back in and says, Mr. and Mrs. Starr, I'm afraid your daughter has a genetic mutation, which is linked to a condition called dystonia. And I deliberately use the word mutation because I think if you can put yourself in the shoes of my parents, you would probably find that quite a scary word if you didn't have any knowledge of genetics. And dystonia, I'm sure for many of the public, is not a condition that they've heard of unless they know someone that is experiencing that as a condition. I'm sure if you're using your imagination, you can imagine the fear and anxiety that that would cause for parents. And hopefully they'd go home with a leaflet or some information, and they would have something to read when they got home. But as I'm sure most people do, the information's never enough to satisfy the questions that you've got. So they probably use Dr. Google. Now, I used Dr. Google today to see what came up for dystonia. And this is one of the things that I found on the first page of images. It doesn't, you can see me on the screen, hopefully. It doesn't look a lot like me. And the last picture that I showed you on the first section of photos was me on the day that I ran a 10K race. So somebody that has that experiences cramping of the foot and a dragging leg and feels exhausted all the time is probably not likely to run 10 kilometers in a race. So that doesn't look like me. And this was the second thing that I found, and this doesn't look like me either. But you can imagine that parents researching this stuff for themselves on the internet are probably going to look at this stuff, and that fear and anxiety is going to grow. And then you go through childhood with your child, and nothing happens, and you're constantly waiting for this diagnosis of dystonia to manifest in symptoms. And at some stage you have to have that conversation with the child, and that fear and anxiety transfers to the child, who's now maybe an adult and constantly waiting for something to happen. And then maybe at some stage they do get some symptoms like I did, but continue to live a normal, and I say normal with real caution, because who knows what normal is, but continue to live a healthy and fulfilling life in the way that I have done, with clearly some little challenges that I have to deal with along the way. Now, I'm giving you my perspective as a patient here, and clearly that's not the same for everybody. I don't have a huge amount of symptoms to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but it is something that causes me problems from time to time. Clearly, there are a lot of people with other situations. But hopefully that using your imagination there has enabled you to really get inside the heads of patients and how difficult that journey could be potentially. Having said that, I'm largely in support of the newborn screening programme, and I think there's some real benefits where a positive benefit can be made to how a condition could develop. I think clearly there's a lot to think about, as Kath said. I just wanted to finish with some final thoughts. I think the first thing is parents must understand the consequences of what they may find out, and also what they may find out in the future when this research continues. They might not get a genetic diagnosis on day one, but if it's continuously researched in the future, they may get one in the future. Adequate information must be provided. I've given you a few examples of the potential consequences of adequate information not being provided at that stage. And I think language is super important. So using words like mutation and normal can be very, very confusing and difficult for people. And I think we've got to be very cautious about that. I think we need to make sure that clinical pathways to follow genetic diagnosis are in place. It's really important that they know, that the patients and the doctors know exactly where to go. Consider the potential mental health impact on both the parents and the children. And then finally, the security of the data is really important. We need to give reassurance about who can access it, when, and what for.
So I want to introduce the next speaker now, who is Felicity Boardman. Felicity is Professor of Social Science in Medicine and Genomics at the University of Warwick. Felicity is a member of the UK National Screening Committee's Fetal, Maternal and Child Health Group, and she's leader of the research project Imagining Futures, the Social and Ethical Implications of Genetic Screening.
The work that I'm presenting today, it's a rapid review that was commissioned by Genomics England in September 2020. So it was designed to explore the attitudes of the general public towards whole genome sequencing in newborns, with a view to informing the public dialogue that then took place last year. So the review that I conducted was structured around 3 core themes, and these were the public, patient and professional views on what the key harms and benefits of whole genome sequencing in newborns might be, broadly speaking. Secondly, we looked at the views of these groups towards the different types of results that parents could receive back from their child's sequence. And finally, we looked at studies that explored the perceptions of implementation and integration of whole genome sequencing within the NHS. And it's mostly from this final theme of the review that I'll be presenting some data from today. So to start with, though, I wanted to show you a theme that cuts across the whole of the review, and this was the theme of genetic exceptionalism. And this is the idea that genomic health information is viewed as essentially different in character to other forms of health data. So members of the public talked about genomic data as being very fixed, sort of fixed, unchanging resource, whereas other forms of health data were seen as much more transient and as fluctuating over time. And the public also drew really strong links between their genome and their personal identity. And as one focus group participant in a recent study commented, our genome is what makes us unique. So it was seen as the code book of life, or the holy grail of health data, authoritative, deterministic, and the source from which all other health data was seen to flow. A recent study asked members of the public which words they associated with whole genome sequencing, and amongst the most frequently mentioned were scientific progress and information. So overall, you get a sense of how genomic data was viewed as a special category of personal health data, and how this influenced the public in terms of how they imagined the harms and the benefits of newborn screening, as well as data storage. I want to now start with some of the benefits that the general public perceived around whole genome sequencing. And we found evidence that the public found the idea of a genomic resource that could be stored and dipped in and out of over time was quite attractive to them. Here's a quote from a member of the public who took part in the public dialogue last year. They said, "Screen a newborn for 400 different potential conditions, but maybe it's possible that the information is parcelled out. You could go back to the parents and let them know about stuff that has immediate impact, but there's no point in a 6-month-old getting a marker for potential future Alzheimer's. That might be more useful when they're maybe 30 and you can start making lifestyle changes that decrease the likelihood that you do then develop the condition." So this idea of parcelling out information from a sequence and only providing it at a time when the information becomes relevant or actionable mentioned as a key benefit by the general public. And the public imagined different scenarios when they thought this parcelled information might be appropriate, including after the development of a new treatment, or as well after a variant becomes to be reclassified as well. But moving into direct clinical care, the possibility of pharmacogenomics and personalised medicine was also seen as a key benefit by the public. So this refers to the identification of a patient's likely reaction to drugs and therapies based on their genetic attributes. And members of the public imagined various scenarios that they felt this information could be vital or even life-saving. And this is another quote from a participant. "Instead of treating everybody all on one level, you can actually target and give them specific individual treatment, which will give them the best chance of surviving." And later on tonight, Mavis will be speaking some more about the current status of pharmacogenomics. But other benefits mentioned included the possibility of genomics leading to better organised and holistic care. So a research participant in another study commented about healthcare delivery. "You do tend to find that people tend to be stuck within their own speciality and don't tend to look at other aspects of the person as a whole. So having a genomic resource was seen as a way to challenge healthcare professionals to look beyond their sort of sub-discipline or speciality and to look at the patient as a whole. But there were also fears raised about this, that genomic data would end up being privileged over and above all other forms of data in a clinical scenario, and including the patient voice, in effect drowning out other forms of data, and genomic data being seen as the only relevant information there is to know about that patient. Moving on to the idea of data sharing, there was some evidence that the public had positive attitudes towards the sharing of genomic data if it was done for clinical benefit. So it was being seen as being able to help with things such as finding out about genetic risks to current family members, and being able to assist in the diagnosis and treatment as well of future generations. Some participants also thought that creating a population-level genomic data resource was also necessary to achieve health benefits for the whole of society. One of them said, "I think there does have to be an open exchange of information in order for some of these really significant things to happen for people's benefits." And those living with genetic conditions were amongst those most likely to support the idea of genomic data sharing. One participant with a genetic condition said, "I'm just really serious about allowing the information from my illness to be used to help others down the line. That to me is the only benefit. Probably isn't going to help me, but it may help future patients." So there was evidence of altruistic motivations for supporting this cradle to grave resource, and for this to be shared with benefits extending beyond the biological family and to wider society. But I want to move on now to think about some of the concerns that were raised by the public, and consent was one of the most frequently raised concerns. Providing genetic results incrementally over the life course was recognised as making truly informed consent really difficult. One participant in the public dialogue said, "You've given consent in 2021. Obviously, you've signed up for the study. Does that then give the researchers, the doctors, the health professionals access to your personal details to then contact you saying, 'We need to bring you in for a diagnostic test because we found a link with this new disease'?" So participants thought that consent is something that needs to be regularly reviewed over the life course. It cannot simply be a one-off by proxy event at birth. But even when consent is given for recontacting, the public still noted that an out-of-the-blue phone call from a genetic health professional can still be a confronting experience when you're not expecting it. And when they haven't been prepared for that result, for the usual mechanisms that surround genetic testing, so things like pre-test counselling. So the public were really concerned about how consent would work, and also the sheer amount of resources it would take to do that job well. Data security was another big concern to members of the public. So data breaches, whether these were malicious or accidental, they were seen as a significant threat, particularly where data is retained for such a long period of time. And one of the participants commented, "The information, once it's out there, it's out there. But policies, legislation, leadership changes over time. And I feel like that's where it becomes really kind of, there's like this grey area and you really can't get any guarantees about it." Another participant thought that a data leak would be inevitable at some point, and participants referenced things like highly publicised NHS data breaches. One participant said, "As soon as there's a database and it's on a computer, sooner or later there is a thing where records all of a sudden get lost, or somebody steals them, or somebody hacks them, or someone's personal computer gets stolen out of their home, and all of a sudden it's gone." So the public wanted to feel safe that only relevant professionals could access their data, and they also wanted to be able to control the specific circumstances around which they did so. And Phil is going to speak more to points about data security later on. It brings me to concerns around potential for commercial exploitation of genomic data. Most of the literature suggests that members of the public did not see this as acceptable use of their data. One of them commented, "I'd like a guarantee that it was only going to be circulated to healthcare professionals, that it's not going to be used for marketing purposes and it won't be sold on. It's not a profit thing." So whilst many felt that healthcare professionals could be trusted as custodians of their data, they raised concerns about things like future privatisation of the NHS, the possibility of mission creep with future changes of government, and the possibility of pharmaceutical companies profiting from their data as all very real concerns. Alongside these views, we also saw some people raising things like seeing commercial exploitation as almost inevitable or even essential in order to spur on scientific progress in drug development. So for some, there was almost like a fatalistic attitude towards the eventual commercial exploitation of a genomic resource. And then finally, the possibilities for discrimination were also raised, particularly related to life insurance, mortgage applications, employment, law enforcement, and also social security benefits. So the public were concerned that their data would inevitably end up in the hands of third parties, and there was an emphasis on the need for trust and confidence in the protection of their information, which may be hard won. One participant commented, "I think, especially in the beginning, it will be really hard for me to trust any sort of storage or security system. And it's not my information, that's my baby's information. It would just be hard for me to put that out there. I think about my own health history and things that I don't qualify for because there's a chance of this or that. And I don't want to put that information out there and take a risk that that could happen to my baby." So one of the concerns here that parents are making decisions about their child's data by proxy. And there was evidence that these views were not evenly dispersed across social groups either. So younger people and those from ethnic minority groups were amongst those most likely to view their genomic data as sensitive and to link it to employment and insurance discrimination. So in line with this, there are calls for protections in the form of the anonymisation of any stored genomic data. However, how far true anonymisation of genomic data is possible has been queried, and again, I think Phil's going to speak to this point later on. So just to summarise, most studies with the public so far, including the recent public dialogue, have generally shown positive attitudes towards whole genome sequencing in newborns and the creation of a genomic lifetime resource. The public were found to perceive a wide range of benefits of the cradle to grave resource, particularly as these related to clinical care for their family and future generations. We also found that they perceived fewer harms than healthcare professionals did around many of these issues. But despite the benefits, they still emphasised that data storage and data sharing needed to be highly regulated, so that it was only shared with trusted healthcare professionals and for the purposes of clinical benefit only, whether or not that was their own clinical benefit. However, the public did accept that there were some risks to doing this, and one study used the term the privacy-utility trade-off to describe the way in which the public are generally willing to trade some of their privacy and control of their data in exchange for the individual and collective benefits that they perceive genomic medicine is bringing. And finally, and one of the most important findings of our review is that much more research is needed, and especially on the differences in views across social groups and how these might ultimately impact uptake and implementation of any future whole genome sequencing service.
Next, we have Dr. Mavis Machirori, and Mavis is a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. Mavis was previously a midwife at Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust, and she has been a researcher at Newcastle University as well as at the University of Glasgow.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the questions that may arise with whole genome sequencing. We've heard from the other three speakers that there are potential benefits, but there are always kind of these ethical questions, moral questions as well. And I'm going to touch a little bit more about some of the kind of concerns that might arise in terms of a resourcing perspective. So Felicity has already touched on issues of choice and personalized medicine. So I'm just going to cover a little bit of that in this talk. And first, one of the first questions is, why is this important to even have these conversations? And I think one of the fundamental things that I see in thinking about the potentials that may emerge from such a large database that would come from whole genome sequencing is in terms of participation, representation, and what this might mean for increasing or reducing inequalities within the healthcare space. One of the things that we have to think about is, for instance, which groups already have the least satisfaction within the NHS, and how are those groups represented in the current healthcare setting, and are those groups going to be impacted even in worse ways? And I'll show how this is actually a potential a potential impact of this work if we don't put in additional safeguards. So what I was saying was basically when we think about whole genome sequencing, we cannot just look at it as a resource on its own. We have to think about where it fits within the whole healthcare setting, and where, for instance, people have already been experiencing inequalities, and whether we might be able to do something to reduce those inequalities, or whether the decisions that we will be making by creating whole genome sequence as a massive database is going to widen those inequalities. And for this, we have to address issues of data quality. For instance, we already know outside of genomic sequencing that a lot of skin conditions are difficult to diagnose in dark-skinned populations. We know from a very recent NHS Race Observatory report that a lot of newborns from Pakistani backgrounds, for instance, are overrepresented in neonatal units for issues of jaundice, which actually might not necessarily be jaundice, but there's something about the ways in which healthcare professionals interact with people who might have darker skin, not necessarily because they intend to, but it could be even issues around our own knowledge. And how are these translated into the ways that we might be thinking about, risks that might emerge from whole genome sequencing? And then we have to think about, if we already have these issues in the ways in which we produce healthcare, is genomics as a technology and potential other technologies that may emerge, are these the right ways of kind of addressing those concerns? So we've heard about consent, but I'd like to kind of take a step back and think about the practicalities of how consent is collected. What is the meaning of genomics, both for the people giving the consent, but also the person taking the consent, and where does that responsibility lie? And I give an example from a midwifery setting, for instance, where we might seek consent from the person giving birth. And if that person says yes, but their partner, who might be the father of the baby, says no, who do we listen to? Is the responsibility of the midwife to the mother, or is it to the family as a whole? So how do we even resolve those kinds of tensions? And this also changes if parental guardianship comes in. What happens if it is IVF? Do we go to the person who's donated that egg or the sperm to say, are you happy if you're donating your sperm or egg that child will eventually have their genome sequence, because it might actually have implications for their own health as an adult. So in trying to resolve these potential parental differences, there are many ways in which consent suddenly becomes really complex, for which a lot of healthcare professionals haven't even had the training for. And I speak as somebody who has been in those situations where you find yourself having to kind of think about, okay, so how do we talk about consent in a way that is beyond just signing a piece of paper? But of course, consent also changes over time, right? So that's another thing that we need to be thinking about. And so it's something around the preparedness of the health force to be able to have these potentially routinized discussions, because of course, as we move from, for instance, there was talk about the heel prick test and the blood spot from the cards, the screening already that happens in pregnancy. A lot of these conversations actually become routine, even though they have potential massive implications for people's health. They become so routinized, and is there a possibility that something that could be as complex as whole genome sequencing is not going to be given the time that it needs within the current structure of the healthcare system? It's certainly not going to be given any extra time within a 20-minute appointment, for instance. And then we have to think about when to have those discussions. Is it in the antenatal period? Is it when people are still planning their pregnancy? So these are all the things that we need to be thinking about. And then there's also an issue of the translation of medicine, where we might be thinking of, this amazing database, but actually the promises might not match to the actual realities. And we don't have to wait for newborn screening to think about what those promises might be. We already know that within the adult settings, not everyone is benefiting from genomic studies. And so if we're going to be keeping pace with new insights, newborn screening might need, whole genome sequencing in newborns might need a reference population. It might need reference information to make sense of that information of the, that the newborn is producing. But if we don't have enough data to make those comparisons, it means that not everyone is going to actually get information in the same kind of way. So we know from adult studies that, for instance, in cancer, people from Black backgrounds might not always receive results that make sense because maybe there isn't anything really in the current understanding of the genome that really tells us why they have these mutations or what these mutations might mean. So they receive things called variants of unknown significance. And we're not saying it's not significant because it doesn't have health implications, but we're saying for what we know now with the information we have, we can't really say anything else. So if this is the situation in adults, how is that going to translate to whole genome sequencing for children or for newborns? And at what time frame do we promise that people are going to be benefiting from these resources? And kind of as a case in point, somebody said in a previous study that they were participating in genetic testing for cancer conditions because they were hoping that in the future they might, somebody with a similar background might benefit. So you can already see that there are ways in which people might be willing to provide information, but they also recognize that they might not be able to benefit in the moment. And these are discussions that need to be had about the potential future of whole genome sequencing. There's so much data out there that talks about biases in patient data. And I think we cannot ignore those biases in terms of how we move forward in structuring the ways in which we would provide healthcare. This has already come out in a paper that came out recently about the role of exome sequencing, for instance, in newborn screening. And what this paper showed was that a study in California actually left some populations out because, again, the ways in which they were comparing the data was only based on certain demographics, and so not everyone was benefiting. And so we have to think about whether whole genome sequencing in the UK is going to be a local practice or whether it's something that will have global impact. We already know, for instance, looking at studies that have taken place in the last few years, the last couple of decades actually, that there's a massive gap in terms, like as I was saying, of where the genome comes from or the analyses that are happening. And as you can see on this chart, it's massively overrepresenting people who are identified or self-identified as European. And we know that people who hold what might be termed an African genome actually have the widest kind of variety of difference in the gene. So how can we kind of marry those two differences? Felicity talked earlier about a genetic counselor calling you, but actually we also know that there isn't enough workforce in that sense to even just respond to the current needs of the population. So is there something that's going to be done about training extra workforce to be able to have these complex conditions? And again, as the example I was giving, we already know that there are these different responses to kind of sequencing and the results that currently exist. So how is this going to then be translated into what we may or may not be able to say about newborns? So basically what I'm saying is there's a laundry list of issues about, the ways in which we may be thinking about whole genome sequencing. We have to think about what AI might do in that space. If we have a database, and I'm not saying this is the role of whole genome sequencing discussions at the moment, but we do have to think about if we're going to be able to analyze something that is so massive, we do need AI capabilities within that. And so if we're thinking about what we might say in the now and interpreting information that currently exists, do we then need to kind of continuously update that information? Do we need to continuously create new models? And if that's the case, and interpretation happens continuously, who's going to have responsibility to feed back that interpretation? If we need external health information to make use of that interpretation, who has the responsibility to be continuously uploading that information? So there's a lot of kind of practical coordination that needs to happen to actually be able to make use of this resource. Otherwise, we're just going to be collecting information and storing it and not actually producing the benefits that we have promised people.
Phil is an identity and privacy advocate, and he is coordinator of medConfidential. Previously, he was the national coordinator of the No to ID campaign, which was a campaign against ID cards.
What I propose to do is maybe start off by broadening the context a little, and then to drill down and flesh out some specifics and practicalities, given we are talking, or seem to be talking, almost exclusively about a giant database. But first, and I think this was already raised, the idea of anonymizing genomic data. Genomic data is never anonymous, especially if it is or needs to be linked or linkable to your medical records. This is self-evident. A bunch of data may not look like you on a screen to look at all the A's and C's and G's and T's, but it is and has to be linkable to and in fact the correct individual's clinical records in order for research to be done. So let us please not go down the path, as has unfortunately happened in previous sort of debates, of saying that genomic data can be anonymous. Indeed, genomic data or DNA data only gets more identifiable over time. We found out just last year in the context of COVID, but in sort of more advanced research, and not just looking at genomics, your DNA, but proteomics, what is going on inside the cell or the organism, it turns out that there are markers, discernible, identifiable markers available in proteomic data as well. So, we are talking about here a class of data. I know we don't want to be exceptionalist about it, but this is a class of personal data that is quite distinct from other types of personal data in that it is not just about you. It is always about your family as well. And so this makes all sorts of things around consent and all these other stuff all the more complex, not insoluble, but much more complex, because we actually haven't worked out all of the legal, statutory and social implications of this yet, which is why this slow public engagement in stages, I think, is the right way to go. I'll make just a plain assertion, but it's true. Any population scale genomic database for any purpose is also a population scale forensic database. If you've got all of the information from whole genome sequencing, then you have got the information for the markers, the combination of 11 markers on your chromosomes that is used as the fingerprint to look someone up or to match someone in the national DNA database that police and Home Office use. So the question then becomes, if you've got this, if you created this collection of everyone's data and retain it from the rest of everyone's lives, how will you refuse the police or the courts or the Home Office or some other part of government running whatever they want on it? You aren't the ones passing the laws. You aren't the ones with the terrorism powers. You aren't the one with all these other things. So we need to be clear that this is not solely a health database. It is in a broader social context. And we've, again, got plenty of history, unfortunately, of the Home Office going digging for immigrants in the NHS records, for example, which we've fought on for several years. The risks are not just down to single matching, of course. Familial matching, as I mentioned, the police have and do look at and find suspects, generate suspects on the basis that they are related or closely related to a physical sample that they have. Now, this has gone notoriously wrong in a number of times over in the States. But again, if you create an asset like this, be aware that others will use it. And the risks are not just, by the way, hacking and this random boogeyman. The vast majority of things are insider breaches, sharing data that you think is entirely legitimate, but it turns out someone does something wrong with it, and we have seen motivated rogue actors, even up to the level of nation states. The Chinese notoriously have big hacker teams, and they exfiltrated large amounts of data about the diabetes of US citizens, millions things because they just didn't want to wait around for the research to be published. Yeah, so be aware of that context. Yeah, it's not just notional data security we're talking about here. There is a genuine risk of a hostile environment. You also have to ask about the political context. How much of this is being driven by the very explicit government life sciences industrial strategy? Several people have already noted that we don't have enough genetic counsellors, and yet we're proposing to spend billions on something that could help with research, but that also helps an economic agenda. Yeah, and for years this has been the post-Brexit, if you like, best bet for the British economy is life sciences. Yeah, this is right at the very, very heart of politics and economics post-Brexit. So all of those legislative moves, laws that can be passed, regulations that can be changed, may actually have a direct impact on who can use this and for what purposes. We may have our own principles, our own stated principles, but if you can't back them up because the law doesn't actually support you, because the law has been designed to facilitate international trade in data, then you've got another problem. So on the specifics, why is it we're talking about one giant database? Yeah, if you're designing in ethics, if you're taking an ethical approach, it should come down to the choices you make about architecture as well. Yeah, one could, for example, when one has generated this data, take a diff to see the differences or the variants that are relevant in that person and attach that subset of data to the individual's medical record, GP record or sharecare record. This would be far less storage. It would be, if you like, inbuilt within the governance and confidentiality relationships of the NHS and that data, because it would be within systems that are already linked and related, might be available with governance for periodic rechecking, like we do what's called risk stratification. We find some more information out, you run an algorithm, you don't get anyone's names or anything, but you are able to spot the individuals to whom more information may be relevant. There are questions about the sheer size of the data set. The 100K Genomes project generated 21 petabytes. That's a massive amount of information. And the only other asset roughly similar in size is the medical imaging data that we generate. This is an extraordinary amount of data and is only going to get bigger. That's 100,000 people. We're talking about 50 million. Again, why are we putting resources into that when we could be putting into treatment, or what are the implications, as people have said, for resourcing, feedback and counselling for people who need it? Yeah, and there's very good questions about the diminishing utility of a particular form of whole genome sequencing at a particular resolution over time. Surely the price has come down to a point where considering being able to do this, well, it will continue to go down. And the point at which you set out, embark on a lifelong database using a particular snapshot view of a technology at a certain price, this is not reasonable in technology terms if you're thinking about 20, 30 years hence. There are a bunch of more exotic ways that one can protect this data, and by and large Genomic England Limited uses what we call state-of-the-art trusted research environments and all sensible measures. But there are all sorts of things that you could do which, as I say, wouldn't involve generating a giant singular pot of highly risky, if not highly valuable, data. And I was very glad that people mentioned around the sort of consent, the consent, but also just the governance that we are talking about for lifelong studies, is very different than the sort of consent that we're used to generally within the NHS. You rock up for treatment, you expect your data to be shared amongst your care team for the delivery of health. Then there is this separate thing, research, which many people are happy with, but which you have a right not to participate in. With genomics, that line is blurred a bit because we still don't actually know everything. It's not like this is a fixed thing. There's going to have to be some research to derive actual medical value for individuals and society from this. Yeah, so we need to actually address that. And finally, lifelong is a really long time, not just in technology terms. It's not just an individual, it's all individuals. We're talking about the lifetimes of everyone being treated by the NHS. Yeah, this is much bigger than one person's life, and the decisions that we're making here, you know, they have to be played out across generations, across families, across communities. There are so many dimensions here which, you know, we really haven't yet explored to the point where I think we can sort of say, oh, okay, we're ready to go to a service. Yeah. Ultimately, you know, if you want a binary decision, people's genomes, once sequenced, will either be retained indefinitely or not. And all the hard questions start from the very first pilot. Yeah. And it lasts for 30 years, 40 years, but you've got to address this stuff up front, as some of the other speakers have said. And we do this in a context, unfortunately, where, not being alarmist, you know, we have in recent years had, you know, literally people, advisors in number 10, sacked for being eugenicists. Yeah. So let's be careful, let's be sensible, and let's try to find a way that maybe isn't predicated upon creating a huge risky thing if we can achieve it in other ways.
I just want to introduce Arzoo Ahmed, who's the ethics lead at Genomics England. And her role involves embedding ethics into the operational design of the programme and developing the ethics programme of research that sits alongside it. She's worked at the Nuffield Council on bioethics, and she's a member of the Ada Lovelace Institute's Health Inequalities Project too. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks also to all of the speakers this evening. It's so nice to be amongst former colleagues and friends. And Sarah, we're particularly grateful to you and the team at PET for hosting these conversations. They've been extremely instrumental for us so far in helping us think about how best we can design our programme. And these questions are an incredible resource for us. If it's okay, I'll just say a few words just to offer maybe some of the background around how we're thinking about this lifetime resource or lifetime offer piece of the programme within the team. It's probably useful to reiterate again, because I don't think we can say this enough. The Newborn Genomes Programme and this research pilot that we are undertaking is a study to provide and explore the evidence to inform decisions on whether any of these three aims, be it the screening, be it the research, or the aspect of a lifetime resource, whether any of these should be implemented more broadly across the NHS. So what we're running over the next 3 years is a research pilot, but any decisions about the future service remain completely open and undecided, and they will be informed by whatever it is that we discover along the way, and covering many of the questions that have been raised this evening. And on the lifetime offer specifically, this is a much more exploratory part of the programme, and it's there to scope out what the work of the pilot should even look like in this space, and how it is that we could use the genome in a clinical context as something that we could go back to at different points, and exploring both the potential benefits, but also the downsides of this idea of a lifetime genomic resource. And I think we've had some really great stuff this evening about some of the challenges of this particular thing. Like in a very specific example, one of the things that as a program team we have in mind is if a child was enrolled into this program by their parents and they tested negative at that screening point, but then two years down the line, they got quite sick. Could we reanalyze that child's genome very quickly and have mechanisms in place for that doctor looking after this child to request a reanalysis of the genome? And really exploring through the pilot, what would it take operationally in terms of the cost, the resources, the time, the storage aspects,
And also, what would be the wider implications for the NHS infrastructure and the overall opportunity costs for doing something like this? But most importantly, and no bias here because I'm the ethics lead on this program, what would be the ethical implications of having mechanisms in place to allow us to do this? And we'll also be asking, is it cheaper to store the genome or just to resequence it? So we don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, and this pilot and this particular aspect of the pilot is really an opportunity for us to explore kind of and generate the right evidence. And when we're thinking about storing the data and what's the appropriate storage time, it could be it's a very open question again at the moment. Should we just store the data during the course of the pilot for the 3 years? Should it be for the next 10 years? Should it be indefinitely for as long as it makes sense for this study? So, you know, I think the key thing I'd really like to get across is that the pilot is an opportunity for us to ask and answer some of these questions to inform that broader conversation across society about what it would look like to have these structures in place. And also, you know, what would be the best architecture of doing this? It may turn out that it's not worth storing the genome because the technology has evolved, but those questions will still remain about the role of the genome in that clinical context. So we're hoping that we'll be able to conduct ethics research, particularly, well, on all 3 aims, but particularly about this aim, and to explore what might the acceptable norms look like outside of the context of this research study. And just as we do with other birth cohorts, I think what's really important to us is keeping a very close relationship with our participants once they enter into this study, and think about ways in which we can keep in touch with them, how frequently we should go back to them. And I think, you know, I am as worried about the future dystopian scenarios that could result from these programs and the advances that we're making in genomics and the potential links to of genomic data sets to employment, insurance, and discrimination. And so it's just so crucial that we're having this discussion and starting this dialogue with our participants, with the healthcare system, and with all of our stakeholders to anticipate some of these challenges and make sure that we've really taken all of the considerations into account as we're designing this program. So this is from an anonymous attendee, has asked, a lifelong resource, does consent end at death? So I suppose the point we're getting at here is, I suppose, what happens if this project goes ahead and it is stored, then what happens when a person dies? Is their data removed? How is that handled, and how should it be handled?
British law, European law, the GDPR, relates to, or says that personal data is data about a living individual. Yeah. When someone dies, it is no longer considered to be personal data. So all sorts of things potentially become possible or available. However, in a health context, a medical context, we also have what's called the common law duty of confidentiality. Every registered medical professional has that, so one would hope that would be applicable here as well. And that says, well, look, you know, this applies to information that was given while someone was alive, because of course there are things about you in your medical history that maybe have impact on, possibly be embarrassing even for, you know, members of your family. So there is some appreciation of this. Yeah, but it's by far a fully resolved question, and I would fear that because, you know, there's a clear driver to make a large amount of data available for research, there would be extensive lobbying to say, well, we'll take the GDPR definition. Once people have died, you know, consent expires, but it's not personal data, so off we go. Well, it is personal data because it's about all the people they're related to. That's why I say we need to unpick this stuff.
Catherine, I'd be interested to know if you've got some thoughts on this from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics perspective, if it's something you've considered.
Well, not specifically, but, you know, just from my kind of personal view, I think, again, this gets complicated because of this, we're talking about both genomic data being used in a clinical public health setting, but also in a research setting. So if in a research setting, you can ask for consent to keep data after death, which I believe is what happened in the 100,000 Genome project. So if people sadly die, then their data remains in that database. So it depends what you ask for, I think. So, and it depends how this whole thing is being set up. Is it for the health benefit of individuals, or is it to promote research and innovation, or is it both? And it's yeah, gets a bit blurry, as Phil was alluding to.
And Sabine, you've participated in the 100,000 Genomes project. Is this something you've reflected on at all?
I mean, it's a while since I filled out those consent forms, so I have no idea anymore what was on them because it's quite some time ago. I mean, my personal view is that once I'm dead, I'm not going to care anyway. So, but it may be of use to benefit. My data may be of benefit to somebody else in the future, depending on the information that comes out of that research. So, yeah, personally, I don't have any concerns in that data being kept once I'm gone. Hopefully, that won't be too soon.
I hope not to. And Felicity, was this something that you came across at all when you were doing your review?
No, not specifically, but I think what was really emphasised by the public when their attitudes were explored was how they saw this, how they saw genome sequencing and the benefits of it as being dispersed across generations, and as potentially bringing benefit to future generations as well. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that that is how a lot of people approach some of these issues about consent, that they were taking into account the benefits for future generations as well.
Great. Does anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, could I jump in? I think that it's an interesting point about where the person ends as the person, right? It kind of feels like we're trying to define where you as a person ends, and genomics actually opens that up because suddenly the information about you also brings in other people. So does that information die when you go to the grave? I don't know what the answer is, but there are also things that we can learn about how similar kinds of research, maybe not so much whole genome sequencing, but kind of genome research has been happening in indigenous communities in places like Australia, in Southern African countries, about the relational kind of community approach to understanding what genomics means. And I think there are ways that we can learn from the ways in which those communities interact with these ideas of, personhood or individuality versus communities. And so, again, thinking about whole genome sequencing, let's not look at this as only something that is particular to the UK, but think about what else is happening globally and the ways in which some of those conversations have been tackled.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I suppose thinking about whether it's sort of, the information dies with you and is removed from a database, I suppose I could imagine a scenario where parents have a young child who has something that is life limiting, that dies young, but actually would think that keeping that in the database would be beneficial, especially if they're thinking about having more children over the course of time. So I suppose there are lots of elements to sort of think about and balance here. There were a couple of questions early on about blood spot cards, because that was mentioned, I think, in Catherine's presentation. So I'm just going to, one was from Jim Bonham and the other one was from Viv Parry. So I'm going to sort of mash those two together. So Jim says, I think it would be unwise to assume that people are relaxed about the storage of dried blood spot cards and their use in research. It's very clear that dried blood spot cards are stored to check the programme, not with primary research intent. If they could, they'd be stored very differently. And then Vivian's question was, is the situation different in Scotland in terms of blood spots? Aren't they retained in perpetuity and used extensively for research?
Yeah, so the Guthrie cards, the baby bloodstock cards in Scotland is where they started. They've got about 30, probably over 30 years worth of them now, and they are retained indefinitely. However, there has been a long, almost decade long now, debate, discussion, as yet unresolved, around whether those historic Guthrie cards can be used for research, and specifically for genomic research, and that's where I've been involved in several rounds of debate. I put links into the Q&A if people want my answers to a publication that the Scottish Government itself put out in 2014, and one that the Nuffield Council on Bioethics put out in, I think, 2019. But it's a complex issue. In short, they've done some tests to show that it is practicable, it is possible to get usable genomic data from a 30-year-old Guthrie card. Yeah, so it's not an academic question, but because they were gathered in a completely different context and with other legal protections around them in Scottish law, it's just not something they can do on the historic thing. We need to be talking about prospective solutions here. And I think that's the joy of having this debate and discussion now, is that we are going to find ourselves hopefully in the same position that Scotland finds itself in, where simply I think they're stuck. Basically, I think they're stuck.
Okay. Other panelists, do they want to come in? Catherine, did you want to come in as you sort of raised this in your presentation?
Yeah, I don't know loads about it. I think Jim's point is interesting, that we shouldn't assume people are okay with it. And I think you often get this when a debate is sparked by a particular event. So in this case, by the Genomics England's Newborn initiative, so it's sparked this question. It's not a new question. These aren't new things. In fact, we've even got this, sort of parallel where, samples are being taken and potentially accessed, even though, it's done for slightly different reasons and not designed in that way. But it's possibly just that, it doesn't mean that it's okay. It means we probably are due to review that and have a proper conversation about it, which is why this kind of event's really important.
Mavis, given your former career as a midwife, I wondered if you wanted to come in on this. And
yeah, only from I remember being completely shocked that those samples were even being stored, because that was not a conversation I was having with parents when we were collecting the samples, right? It's very much, these are the conditions that we're searching for, and they don't sign anything. So if it turns out that there is research that is then, taking part, and I think there's also kind of a two-way, when we talk about research, it's not always external people, say from an NHS lab, coming in to analyze this. It could be NHS labs continuously doing research, obviously for quality control, but also to see if those samples still give us what we think they did. So there are all these levels of research, and I think that also needs to be kind of clarified, like, who do we mean as the researcher? It might not necessarily be somebody accessing information from an external organization. But yeah, it wasn't a conversation I remember ever having with parents about, your sample, the baby sample can be used for the research purposes. But yeah, more questions.
Exactly, you feel like you start looking at one thread and give it a slight tug and everything starts unraveling. So do any of the other panelists want to come in on this one, or should we move on? Arzoo.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that we're also working on the basis that we shouldn't assume that people are okay with the storage of their data and what is done with that data beyond what they expect. So we're doing some engagement work with parents at the moment around how they would feel about the storage of this data and for how long and for what purposes it should be used. And I think we've got a good precedent with the 100,000 Genomes project of engaging with participants to be open and transparent about where their data is being stored and for what purposes that data will be accessed and in what ways, securely and safely. So I think it's absolutely right that we should continue to think about these questions and exploring what are the norms and are those norms changing and what are the expectations around where this data is stored, whether as tissue samples or as the sequence data as well.
Great, thanks for that. Arzoo. So I'm going to move on now to the next question. This is from someone who's chosen to be anonymous. Will it be data reanalysis? Isn't it highly feasible that the sequencing technology will advance sufficiently that new DNA samples will be taken, a new sequencing test done, that can already predict that long read sequencing will be more advantageous than the current whole genome sequencing being done? So I'm going to go to Arzoo first, because I think it's sort of a bit of a practical question for Genomics England in the first instance.
Yeah, I think we're very aware that this is a highly developing and constantly changing and evolving landscape in terms of the technology, and the kind of as the technology develops, it may mean that storing these genomes is not necessarily the best way. So that is one of the key questions that we're exploring throughout this pilot, is what is the best way of doing this, and perhaps storage of genomes might not be the best way.
Okay, do any of the other panelists want to add anything to that? Phil?
I mean, it does speak to the utility point here. It's a massive investment, but yeah, what is genomic data? And what are we trying to do here? At the moment, you can take a snapshot of someone's genome. It's basically fixed from conception. Yeah. And then we say we're going to keep it for the rest of their life, and maybe parcel out some information about them. Surely, in the longer term, the NHS or any rational health service confronting or utilizing these technologies would be looking for a use more in the proteomics end of things, i.e., when someone is ill and they rock up ill, you use these technologies to find out the state of the person in front of you, and frankly, even what's going on inside their cells. That's the wonders of these things. We have globally mapped the mutation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus using proteomics. We were able to identify pathways within the cell that gave potential vaccines a way to attack it. Yeah, to be talking about genomic data and lifelong storage of a whole genome sequence in 2022 seems to me to be incredibly short-sighted.
Do any of the panelists want to come in? I was going to just sort of make an observation about, we saw how things have changed over Sabina's lifetime from her family photos. Nothing was digital then. I'm guessing she scanned those photos to share with us this evening. And I suppose that just, it's a very simple illustration of how fast the technology could move during, before you got to Ibiza and we're drinking rum. So yeah, I think we can all relate to that. So moving on then, another anonymous question. In terms of data storage and accessibility, what happens to the data should people choose to move jurisdiction or country, or just moving between NHS England and NHS Scotland? Would that information be able to follow them around? So I'm going to go to Arzoo first. Is that something that you've thought about yet at Genomics England?
I'm not sure about the jurisdiction part of it, but we are definitely looking at the kind of the interoperability of what we currently have with the National Genomics Research Library, and how this can work most efficiently with the NHS systems as well. And these are quite very live questions that we're still trying to figure out. How can the data be shared within that clinical context in the most effective way? And there is a slight difference in the data that's being stored for research versus data that's being used clinically. I think that there's that question of the environment there as well.
Mavis, I know you're on some committees that are looking at this sort of as a global question more. I wonder if this has come up at those meetings? Have people been talking about how this would track people about?
As in the ones that I've been, not so much about how to track, but a lot of kind of the conversation is around interoperability and making sure that if it was for research, that people could access without necessarily moving that data, but also kind of clinicians adding information to like more central databases that other clinicians then can come in and see and kind of think about some of the ways in which certain conditions are, manifesting in certain populations, and sharing that kind of information so that whoever then went and looked at the genome could have additional information that necessarily didn't come from their own clinical practice. But like Arzoo is saying, it also demands creation of structures where, data can actually talk to each other. And we know in a lot of areas within the NHS that this isn't possible, unfortunately.
There's just to add on to what Mavis has said, there's also this idea of trusted research environments talking to each other. And there's some ongoing research at the moment about how that should be done. How can we get these data sets to talk to each other without the data traveling to different places? So watch this space, I guess.
And Catherine.
Yeah, just to add, when we were doing the public dialogue last year, I remember a session where a lot of the participants were very interested to find out how countries talk to each other and what genomics research is going on other places, and has everyone got kind of separate databases? Why have we got one big one? We're just a sort of global population. And they weren't so kind of concerned about, the UK and what we're doing here. They were thinking, COVID has forced us to think globally in our place in the global world. So they were very keen that whatever we did wasn't duplicating, and also was helping others in other places. So I think that's something, it probably is a really difficult thing to do. But yeah, I think if there was going to be, public support for this kind of thing and public acceptability, you would have to take the global context into consideration.
And Phil, you want to come back?
Hi there. So in terms of what we are sharing, if you are going to, if you allow your data to be retained, you're going to hand it to a data controller. And that controller will have mechanisms. Yeah, it's unlikely that you, the individual, unless you are literally given a copy of your your genomic data, are going to transport it across jurisdictions. So as Mavis says, it's about the infrastructures and arrangements between countries. However, we're already seeing some of this emerge. Okay, let's just take the UK. I don't know as much about the global situation, but I'm aware that there are, for example, reference data sets that are worked on globally, for helping to categorize and recategorize variants, for example. There are stores, repositories of information that are shared generally across countries, but I don't think we're talking about that sort of resource here. However, in Ireland, a commercial company formed a deal with the Irish government sovereign fund, and it's essentially this American-fronted Chinese company sequencing the DNA of 600,000 Irish citizens. What's happening now? They've got a high street sampling facility in Dublin. Okay, so if we don't come up with sensible answers to this soon, poor administrators, poor politicians will simply just allow stuff to happen, and then who knows where that data goes. Well, in that case we know where it goes, China. But it's we actually have to come up with reasonable answers here, otherwise it's not, we can't just leave this around. And I would say, and as we mentioned this, trusted research environments are probably at the moment the most sensible prospect. Genomics England Limited already has one. NHS Digital already has one. There's your, roughly speaking, medical records and your genomic data. That can be looked at, accessed by any legitimate researcher from anywhere in the world, but they have to come to the data, not sending or copying data to them. And I think, if we stop thinking about data following you around and think more about, look, we're going to look after it, protect it properly, whatever we do, and then you have to go through proper processes in order to be able to access it, but we can see exactly what you're doing with it. I think that's probably the most potentially trustworthy way of doing it.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to move on now to a question from Mercy Uwajabo, and I apologise if I mispronounced your surname, Mercy. And she wants to know, could this sort of information affect life and other insurances? Could it affect people who want to adopt? And I think, who should we go to first for that one? I think perhaps we'll go to Catherine.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't know about adoption, but there is a moratorium with insurance companies in this country, and they're not allowed to use genetic data to set their premiums at the moment. And I believe that moratorium has just been renegotiated for another period of time. Phil's nodding, so that's good. He knows more about it than me. So I think maybe just it's worth thinking. So we've been having these kind of worries about genetic data being misused for a very long time. Certainly, probably, the whole lifetime of PET, for example, over the last 30 years. And I think, I'm not saying we should sort of rest on our laurels, but the dystopian future hasn't come about. There's been debates at different points, and we as a society, I would say, said, no, that's not appropriate. We don't want our insurance companies accessing that, and there's been an action. The same with the police DNA database. There's a big debate about that. Lots of people, great organisations advocating for, people who might have been adversely affected by that. We do not have a whole population DNA database for that reason, because the people said no. So I think that's reassuring to me that we are having a say, we are making our voices heard on these kind of issues. So I think, yes, we should still worry about genetic information being used in an employment setting, other things, dating, for example, another one that came up in the public dialogue. But as long as we're having these open conversations and are able to influence, then, personally, I feel like we've got a good chance of heading in the right direction.
Do any of the other speakers want to come in now? Felicity, I mean, it's something that came up in your review as concerning to the public.
Yeah, I think that knowledge about the moratorium is really low, and also trust that it's going to be followed through. I think there's still residual concern about that data getting into the hands of third parties, and not only sort of concerns about insurance and what people may be disqualified from, but also around commercial exploitation as well. But I think, as I said in my presentation, that although the public had these concerns, they saw such a wide range of benefits of doing this that they were almost willing to accept a degree of risk with regards to their data, because they saw such widespread benefits as coming from whole genome sequencing, both for their family and wider society. But these were definitely raised as concerns.
Yeah. Mavis, did you want to come in, or are you just nodding? I can
no,
see.
Both. I'll be quick though. I think they're really interesting discussions around the current state of society, right? And the ways in which we're thinking about the future based on the ways in which our society is currently structured. That might change. In 5 or 10 years' time, we might decide, actually, we don't want particular traits in society. So what does that do? But then also thinking about the role of kind of technological companies and the ways in which they might change the kind of analytics that emerge and the insights that emerge from these kinds of databases. And that could potentially shift what was classed as normal and where the moratorium currently exists. If suddenly that, there's the change in kind of societal mood, that moratorium isn't fixed, and it could change. And we can see this in the ways diseases have been classified. So things that were previously seen as just kind of, this is what people do as they're growing up, and suddenly like, oh, actually, this is not acceptable. And maybe if we find a genetic cause for that, we can do something. So I think there's always interesting ways about the ways we think about the future based on what we currently think society is acceptable, but that always changes.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with the panelists as well about that, there's poor understanding, it's poor knowledge that there is a moratorium and poor understanding of what it is. I mean, the word moratorium itself doesn't really help. And I think it's perhaps not terribly reassuring for people to think it's not something that is, although it has, it has continued and kept being renewed, to know that there's not that sense of permanence to it, that if you're signing up to something from cradle to grave, on behalf of your children, and thinking about their future, that you maybe actually have more concern about if you if you thought about it, but it's not necessarily the first thing that springs to people's minds, I suppose, and that is part of the issue and part of the going to be the comms challenge, I think, here as well, isn't it? Right, I'll shut up and get on with questions. So an anonymous attendee said there are many people who don't want to know that what they may be at risk of in the future. How would that be handled if they had no choice at birth? So I think we'll perhaps go to Catherine there first, and then we'll go to Arzoo, who I'm sure has got some ideas about this already.
Yeah, talking about children and genetic analysis of children always adds an extra layer of complication because, of course, they can't consent for themselves when they're babies anyway. So it's consent by proxy from the parents. So I think that adds this kind of extra element of jeopardy, as it were, and an extra element of the need for caution. Because when you're making a decision about yourself, then, you know, it's possibly a different one to one you might make about your child. So I think we have to be extremely cautious. I mean, I'd say like the generally accepted view is that you only do a genetic test or a genetic screen on a child if it is of very near-term benefit to them. So a condition which will manifest in childhood, a condition which can be treated in childhood and is also serious enough to warrant that kind of intrusion. I can't see that moving too much at the moment. So I think if we're talking about further information beyond that, then it's that the consent has got to be done again when they're an adult, potentially at different stages of their life, as some were suggesting in the research that Felicity mentioned.
Arzoo, where are you with your thinking on this?
It definitely very similar to what Kath has just shared. During our dialogue, we had a very clear steer from participants that only information that relates to childhood onset actionable conditions should be shared with parents. And I think what's really important to us within the programme is to retain this principle of the right to an open future for future children. And so not sharing information with anyone about what may happen during the adult course of that child is a central principle of the programme. And one of the things we're also working on is thinking about how we can get young people involved much earlier on in the process. So rather than waiting until the age of 16, when they are usually approached for not reconsent, because they were never consented directly, but when they are approached again for that renewed consent, we're thinking now, would it be useful for us to have those conversations perhaps from the age of 10, 11, 12 onwards, and hopefully we'll set up a young people's panel that can guide us as we design this program and give us an opportunity to hear about what young people think about how we should be using their data as well.
Okay, unless another panelist is bursting to come on this one. Felicity.
Oh, so it was just a quick one, really, just to say that I think this is also really complicated by the fact that a lot of the genetic conditions that present in childhood, they can have very big spectrums of severity, and some of them are late onset, and that by identifying the early onset ones, you may also identify the late onset ones, which brings in extra layers of complexity about whether or not that information is withheld.
There's one from Matthew Hill, who wants to know what are the most realistic timescales of events that may see the introduction of DNA sequencing at birth, and is it a realistic prospect? So we'll go to Arzoo for that one. Hopefully that's a quick one. Arzoo.
Yeah, very quick. So the pilot that we're looking to initiate, we're looking at perhaps spring 2023, so maybe just over a year from now. That pilot would run for about 3 years. And after that, I can't give you any answers because we don't know whether this will become a service. It all depends on the evidence that's generated from the pilot and whether or not it's a good thing to do, whether it's clinically valid, whether it's economically feasible, whether it's practically realistic. So actually, we don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Okay. And then I think the last question is going to be from Jim Bonham. Bearing in mind Phil's comments, if a parent wanted their baby to be included in the research evaluation, but wanted to ensure that after the immediate report had been issued, the data and any associated samples would be destroyed, would that option be available to them? Because it may be popular.
In order to evaluate the screening component of this program, it's going to be really important for us to retain the data to be able to do that short and long-term evaluation and see whether or not the diagnoses that we made, whether they went on to develop the severity in the children that we anticipated, or whether we even missed some diagnoses with people who perhaps remained asymptomatic. So I think being able to track whether or not this program works, it will be important to retain that data for research purposes in the kind of early stages of the program and for however long that's necessary. But the key thing is that parents are aware that this is what they're signing up for. And if people are not comfortable with having that data stored, then there's absolutely no obligation to sign up. So transparency and openness is what we're working towards.
Thanks, Arzoo. Phil, and then I want to give the final word to Sabine as the patient to have the last word on this. So Phil.
Okay. So I mean, very, very quickly, they actually have a legal right to object. It's not for their direct care, and they're processing data for secondary uses. Then consent is one way that you can get that, but you can object, and that may be a challenge. So if the program doesn't have the facility to delete data for purposes other than the person's care, or if it does not have an alternative form of care, if someone rejects that, then it's going to have really, really big problems, maybe tiny sort of location of them, but a really big ethical problem and a legal problem if it doesn't.
Oh, sorry, Phil. Yeah, I think the key things to remember is that people can withdraw at any point, but I was just emphasizing that no one will be forced to sign up to this.
Sure, no, absolutely, and that's why it's good.
Is there.
Yeah,
the
that's
withdrawal.
why it's good. But if someone decides, someone says, "I want the service, but not the research," if that option isn't there, you're going to have problems because it would be eminently challengeable.
That's nothing is set on that. So that's definitely the consent model is being explored. So you're absolutely right.
Sabine.
We've talked a lot about data, and I think the thing that we've got to always remember is that there's a patient at the end of that data, and that patient in some circumstances may be a newborn baby with a specific health challenge that's really causing some worry for the parents, and that might not be the case, but I think we've just got to bear in mind that when we talk about data, often there's a real strong reason for needing to research these genomes, and that is to help benefit patients, whether it be the patient that's being analysed at the time or future patients with similar genetic mutations. So yeah.